You're about to witness a story that's more than just political drama or artistic rivalry. It's a moment of unexpected courage, buried passion, and a woman who refuses to be defined by anyone but herself. Tonight, we step into a glittering Manhattan gala where words fail, but music speaks louder than ever. If you've ever felt underestimated or silenced, this story will hit home. The city lights of Manhattan shimmered through the glass walls of the Glass House Arts Center, casting a warm glow over the most anticipated bipartisan gala of the season. Inside, the air pulsed with champagne bubbles, hushed political murmurs, and flashes from designer gowns and evening tuxedos. Tonight wasn't about policy or polling, it was about cultural diplomacy. Artists mingled with senators, journalists with philanthropists, and at the center of it all, Karoline Leavitt entered with the calm precision of someone used to stepping into high-stakes arenas. Dressed in a sleek emerald gown, her trademark press secretary poise was fully intact, though her eyes scanned every corner of the room like a chess player mapping the next 3 moves. She wasn't here to perform, to dazzle, or even to debate. She was here as a symbol of the administration's youthful face, of Trump's post-presidency cultural reach, and of the power she'd wielded through every briefing room battle. Her aide, Sabrina Doss, walked beside her, whispering strategic names and potential PR landmines. "Keep it light tonight," she warned. "We're not here to win points, just to survive the optics." Karoline nodded, but behind her calm facade something twisted. She could already feel the invisible spotlight. She wasn't just the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, she was also the most polarizing. To the art world attendees sipping Merlot and quoting Rothko, she was a calculated interloper, a political figure who didn't belong in the sacred realm of creative expression, and that was exactly why she'd been invited. For contrast, for controversy. The grand piano in the center of the room gleamed like a challenge no one had yet spoken aloud. Karoline glanced at it once, then turned away. It had been years since she touched keys like those. Sabrina's voice cut through her thoughts again, sharper this time. "Julian Armand just walked in." Karoline's posture stiffened a fraction. She didn't look toward him, yet. But the name alone shifted the temperature of the room. Julian, the darling of progressive salons, the piano provocateur who never missed a chance to publicly dismantle conservative icons. Karoline took a breath. She wasn't on a podium tonight, but that didn't mean she wasn't being watched. The curtains had lifted. Quietly. And somewhere beneath the chatter and clinking glasses, the first note of confrontation was already being played. Julian Armand didn't just enter the room, he arrived, like a crescendo. The doors to the east terrace swung open with theatrical timing, and in he strolled, draped in a midnight blue velvet blazer, a silver silk scarf tossed effortlessly over one shoulder. His hair, tousled with deliberate carelessness, murmurs rippled through the crowd as he passed, half admiration, half calculation. He was everything the arts crowd adored, bold, political, unapologetically left-leaning, and always ready with a quip that could go viral in under 10 seconds. A Pulitzer finalist at 29, now 34, Julian was known as much for his progressive activism as for his piano compositions that blurred classical rigor with social rebellion. To his fans he was a genius, to his critics, a media-savvy provocateur. And tonight, he was hunting. His eyes scanned the room not for art, but for opportunity, and they landed on Karoline Leavitt like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. He didn't smirk, yet, not outwardly, but something about her presence, a conservative heavyweight cloaked in elegance, itched at his sensibilities, a contradiction too tempting to ignore. He made no move at first, instead swirling his wine, chatting with a choreographer about cultural funding, always drifting just a little closer to the piano at the center of the room. The instrument gleamed under the spotlights like a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. Julian could feel it. He didn't need a stage. The world was his performance space, and Karoline, whether she knew it or not, had just been cast in his next act. Across the room, Sabrina Doss noticed the shift and stiffened. "He's circling," she whispered under her breath. Karoline didn't look up from her drink, but her jaw tightened. The air was changing. Julian wasn't just here for applause. He was here for disruption. and the gala, meant to unify, was about to become his playground. It began innocently, or rather performatively innocent, as all of Julian Armand's provocations did. A lull fell over the crowd between the string quartet's interlude and the start of the keynote toast, and that was all the opening he needed. Without invitation or hesitation, Julian glided toward the grand piano, positioned like a centerpiece beneath the massive glass dome. He didn't ask permission, he didn't need to. He was Julian Armand, composer, activist, darling of the cultural left. He lowered himself onto the bench with the elegance of a man born to command attention, and ran his fingers across the keys with a teasing glissando that made a few guests chuckle. But it wasn't music he played, it was theater. He struck a few dissonant chords, deliberately jarring, before lifting his head and letting his voice carry across the room like a microphone had been planted in his throat. "I wonder," he said, eyes locking with Karoline's across the crowd, "can a press secretary play, or does she only know how to bang out talking points?" A few gasps scattered through the room, then laughter, sharp, delighted, predatory. Several journalists turned in their chairs, raising phones with the same instinct they had in briefing rooms when blood hit the water. Karoline didn't blink. She held her wineglass steady, her face unreadable, but inside her stomach turned. She wasn't unfamiliar with being mocked in liberal circles, her name was a lightning rod online, but this was different, this was live, this was calculated. Julian stood from the piano, slowly, and with a flourish gestured toward it, like a stage magician inviting a skeptic to assist. "Come on, Madam Secretary," he called, the words dripping with false charm. "You're in Manhattan now. Surely you've picked up a sonata or two between press briefings and cable news brawls." A reporter in the back called out, "Let her play!" A ripple of laughter followed. The bait had been thrown, and it was beautiful in its cruelty. Sabrina Doss was at Karoline's side instantly, whispering urgently, "Don't. This is a setup. He wants a clip. If you mess up, it'll be viral in seconds." Karoline nodded, but didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, on Julian, on the crowd now fully turned toward her. She could feel the moment splitting in two: walk away and give them exactly what they expected, or take the dare and risk falling apart on camera. She hadn't played in years. Not seriously. Her fingers knew microphones and note cards now, not keys and octaves. But then Julian smiled again, wide, smug, victorious, and something in her stirred. A flicker of the Karoline she'd buried beneath policy briefs and press storms. He thought she was all words, but tonight words wouldn't save her. Only music could. As the laughter echoed and the spotlight of mockery swelled around her, Karoline's gaze lingered on the polished black piano, its surface gleaming like a mirror to a life she'd left behind. Her mind drifted, unbidden, back to a tiny white church nestled in the frost-covered hills of New Hampshire. It was quiet there, so quiet you could hear the creak of the pews as her mother settled in after long shifts at the diner. Karoline had been just 12, too small for her feet to reach the pedals, but big enough to feel the weight of a world that didn't slow down for soft things like music. The church's upright piano was battered and out of tune, its ivory keys yellowed with age, but to her it was a secret doorway. She'd sneak in between Sunday school and choir practice, playing halting versions of hymns, slowly teaching herself melodies from old sheet music, borrowed from the town library. Her fingers had moved with clumsy wonder then, stumbling through Bach and hymnal arrangements, with the kind of quiet hunger only kids with too many emotions and too few outlets understand. Her father had called it a hobby, nothing serious. Her mother had smiled softly and said, "Play what's in your heart, baby, even if no one claps." But as Karoline grew older, that part of her life dimmed. There wasn't room for Rhapsody in Blue when debate team trophies needed winning and political internships had to be chased. The world she chose, politics, power, performance, required armor, not vulnerability. And music was vulnerable. It was memory. It was joy. It was risk. So she boxed it up, sealed it away, and rewrote her identity as a warrior behind a podium. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to play for no reason other than feeling something. Now, standing in the glare of Julian's provocation, and a crowd itching for scandal, Karoline felt that long-buried self stir beneath her ribs. The girl who once played hymns for no one but her tired mother and a dusty congregation hadn't disappeared. She'd just been waiting for a reason to return, and tonight, maybe she finally had one. The room buzzed like a hive around her, full of judgment masked as curiosity. Karoline stood motionless, every eye now resting on her, not as the press secretary, not as Trump's articulate defender, but as a woman on the verge of humiliation or transcendence. Sabrina gripped her arm, voice low and tight. "Karoline, don't. If you're even a little off, this becomes a meme by morning." She was right. The risk wasn't just failure. It was fuel for every late-night host, every trending hashtag. Her critics would feast on the footage. And yet, Julian's smug silhouette at the piano lingered like a gauntlet on velvet, his arms crossed, head cocked, daring her to reveal herself, to prove, as he'd already decided, that she was nothing more than a political puppet in designer heels, a hollow vessel, a mouthpiece. Karoline's fingers twitched, a phantom echo of keys she hadn't touched in years. Her mind was racing, calculating the optics, weighing the risk. But louder than the politics, louder than Sabrina's whispers or the reporter's snickers, was a voice she hadn't heard in a long time, her own, the one from back in New Hampshire, the one that played because it meant something. Trump's voice cut through too. "Don't let them see you afraid. You don't step back. You strike." But this wasn't about Trump, or Julian, or even the left or right. This was about her. Karoline Leavitt, the girl who used to play until her fingers ached and her mother cried in the pews because it was the only beauty they had. The girl who'd buried her softness to survive in a hard town. She looked at the piano again, then at Julian, then down at her own hands, no longer unsure, just remembering. Slowly she stepped forward, heels clicking on the marble like the first notes of a score. Sabrina's breath caught. Julian raised a brow. Karoline didn't blink. She wasn't walking away. Not this time. The moment Karoline's fingers touched the keys, the room seemed to exhale. The chatter dimmed to a hush, and for a heartbeat, time felt suspended, like the breath before a storm, or the silence before a verdict. She sat upright, not rigid but composed, her back straight, hands poised just above the polished ivory, the weight of every gaze pressed against her shoulders, journalists with phones recording, politicos with folded arms, Julian leaning smugly against a column, arms crossed, certain she was seconds from implosion. But Karoline wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were on the piano, wide and dark, reflecting the ballroom's chandelier light like twin orbs of memory. She inhaled once, deep, intentional, and began. The first note was hesitant, not weak, but cautious, like dipping a toe into freezing water. Then another, a cluster, a phrase. She had chosen Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, a bold, unpredictable choice that wove grandeur and grit into one restless, unapologetic voice. At first the music came in fragments, slightly stiff, her hands reacquainting themselves with an old language, rusty but still instinctive. Then, as the melody stretched, something shifted. Her muscles began to remember what her mind doubted. She leaned in. Her right hand danced over the higher octaves, delicate but insistent, while her left planted deeper tones like anchors beneath the storm. The crowd leaned too, subtly drawn forward by the awakening. Julian's eyes narrowed. Karoline didn't hear their whispers now. She didn't need to. The notes were hers, the rhythm hers, and with each bar she reclaimed a part of herself, buried under briefing binders and political war rooms. The keys beneath her fingertips no longer felt foreign. They felt inevitable. She was no longer performing for them. She was remembering who she was. Behind her, Sabrina stood frozen, mouth slightly open. The room that had expected a stumble now watched a rise. And as the notes swelled, cascading toward the first big crescendo, Karoline knew there was no turning back. She wasn't just playing. She was declaring, not with words, but with something far more dangerous. Unfiltered truth. And truth, once spoken through music, could not be spun. The first few measures had been careful, almost analytical, like a press briefing. structured and restrained, but somewhere between the opening glissando and the deep, rolling chords that followed, something inside Karoline broke free. Her fingers, once uncertain, now moved with boldness, not because they remembered every note, but because they remembered how to feel. It wasn't about precision anymore, it was about connection. The music surged through her like electricity, old pathways reigniting with every ascending run. Her hands moved faster, confident now, her posture looser, her breath matching the rhythm. And with each key she struck, Karoline didn't just play, she returned. She remembered those early days like fragments of light through stained glass, soft, imperfect, and holy. The church piano in New Hampshire hadn't been elegant or even fully in tune, but it had been hers. She taught herself in stolen hours, hunched over borrowed sheet music from the town library, slowly deciphering the language of notes and rests like they were ancient runes. There were no lessons, no polished mentors, just determination and a bone-deep need to understand something the world couldn't take away from her. Music had been her sanctuary when the world outside felt too loud, too judgmental, when her father worked late shifts and her mother wore her exhaustion like a second skin. Karoline would press down on the yellowed keys and lose herself in sound. It was never about being perfect. It was about making sense of the things she couldn't say out loud: loneliness, longing, hope. Each melody she pieced together gave shape to emotions she didn't yet have words for. In those moments, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a future campaign worker or the odd girl in debate club. She felt powerful. Music made her feel seen, even if no one else was in the room. It wasn't performance, it was presence. And as her hands now flew across the Steinway in Manhattan, that memory surged through her, not as nostalgia, but as proof. Proof that the girl who had once chased notes in the dark had never left. She'd only been waiting for Karoline to remember that music, at its core, was not about applause, it was about truth, and tonight, she was finally speaking it again. Gone was the woman molded by political necessity, the steel-spaned strategist behind the podium. In her place emerged a younger self, the girl who once played until her mother dozed off in a church pew, who cried into sheet music when no one else understood. That girl had been silenced for years, tucked away behind podiums and press releases, trained to answer instead of express. But tonight, in front of enemies and allies alike, that version of Karoline clawed her way back into the light, and the crowd could feel it. What had started as an attempt to humiliate her was quickly shifting into something else entirely, an awakening wrapped in melody. The audience, once primed for failure, sat frozen in their seats. A few leaned forward unconsciously, drawn closer with each swelling note. Even the air felt different, heavier, reverent. A conservative senator stood up quietly, nodding with growing admiration. One of the liberal arts donors lowered his phone, unable to record now, needing to just listen. Karoline's eyes remained fixed on the keys, but her soul was elsewhere. Half in that New Hampshire church, half in this gleaming Manhattan ballroom, threading the two together through sound. Julian Armand, once the predator at the edge of the stage, no longer smirked. His arms had fallen to his sides, his mouth slightly ajar. What he was witnessing wasn't politics, it was power. Raw, unpolished, unanticipated. A performance that couldn't be edited, couldn't be dismissed, and it unnerved him. He had expected a stumble, a symbolic victory. Instead, she was rising, and every note she played made him a little smaller in the room he once controlled. Midway through the piece, Karoline struck a sequence that surged through the lobby like a heartbeat. Strong, unrelenting, beautiful. She felt tears well behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. This wasn't sorrow, this was reclamation. Every doubt she had about her place in this world, too political for the artists, too emotional for the strategists, burned away under the heat of her own sound. She belonged not because she proved something to them, but because she proved something to herself. As she neared the climax of Rhapsody in Blue, Karoline's movements became a blur, fluid, commanding, unstoppable. The music was no longer something she played, it was something she became. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her hair falling loose, her brow damp with effort. But she didn't care. She was alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, and as the final rush of cascading chords approached, she no longer feared what anyone in the room thought. Because in that moment, surrounded by those who had doubted, dismissed, or tried to define her, Karoline Leavitt remembered she was not just a spokesperson, she was an artist. She was a fighter, and she had just turned a trap into triumph. Julian Armand stood still, his once commanding presence now fading beneath the sheer force of Karoline's performance. As the final notes of Rhapsody in Blue surged through the Glasshouse Arts Center, he felt the ground shift. Not literally, but socially, emotionally, reputationally. What was meant to be a snide takedown, a clever display of dominance in front of cameras and critics, had turned into something he couldn't control. He had handed her the stage expecting a stumble, a crash, something to mock. Instead, he was the one reduced to silence, arms crossed, not in confidence but in uncertainty. The room no longer looked to him. All eyes, hearts, and attention were locked on Karoline. The smirks from his clique of liberal elites had melted into slack-jawed disbelief. A few tried to maintain ironic detachment, whispering theories about political theatrics, but even they couldn't ignore the goosebumps trailing their arms. Julian had been so sure that she was all image and strategy, cold calculation with no soul behind the eyes. And yet here she was, pouring raw emotion into each key, commanding the moment not with applause lines but with something far more elusive, vulnerability transformed into strength. His chest tightened as the audience erupted, not in polite appreciation but in thunderous, rising ovations. Conservative donors rose first, then independents, and finally even those who had whispered insults earlier found themselves clapping, though reluctantly. Julian didn't move. He clapped once, maybe twice, but the gesture was empty, lost in the tidal wave of admiration crashing around him. He had lost, not in a debate, not in a quote war, but in a domain he thought he owned: art, performance, emotional persuasion. Karoline didn't look at him as she stood from the piano. She didn't have to. Her silence, her posture, her presence was louder than any line he could throw. She had faced down not just his arrogance but her own fear, and won. Julian swallowed, jaw tight, as he backed away from the spotlight he had once controlled. For the first time in a long while, Julian Armand had nothing to say, and the silence, thick with humility and unspoken defeat, was deafening. The last note hung in the air like a benediction, rich, resonant, and impossibly still. For a heartbeat, the glasshouse was silent. No clinking glasses, no murmured commentary, just awe. Karoline sat motionless, her fingers resting gently on the keys, her chest rising and falling with the quiet intensity of someone who had just gone to war with herself, and won. She didn't rush to stand, didn't search the room for reactions. She didn't need to. The shift was palpable. What had begun as a trap meant to humiliate her had become a moment of transformation, not just in the eyes of the audience, but within her own identity. Then the room erupted. Applause cracked through the stillness, first from the conservative section, then spreading across ideological lines. People who'd never agreed on a single bill stood together in admiration, not for politics, but for courage. Karoline rose, slow and composed, her legs trembling beneath the weight of adrenaline, but her spine straight. She turned to face the crowd, allowing herself only a small nod, grateful, but not gloating. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She had played for herself, for the girl who once dreamed in hymns and ivory keys, for the woman who had nearly lost her voice behind a podium. Across the room, Julian Armand stood still, his forced clap drowned out by the roar around him. His smirk was gone. His plan had unraveled. Karoline didn't look at him, not out of dismissal, but because he no longer mattered. The real victory wasn't in silencing him, it was in reclaiming the part of herself she had abandoned to survive in politics. Tonight, the press secretary didn't just find her voice again, she found her sound, and with it, a piece of her soul she never thought she'd see again. The performance may have ended, but its echo was only beginning. Within minutes of Karoline's final note, the glasshouse lobby became a flurry of motion, reporters scrambling to upload clips, guests whispering in disbelief, aides exchanging texts faster than their fingers could type. On social media, the moment exploded like a match to dry kindling. A single post, Karoline Leavitt just obliterated a liberal icon with a Gershwin piece, and didn't say a word, amassed tens of thousands of likes in under an hour. Hashtags like Karoline Plays, MAGA with Music, and Ivory Reckoning trended across platforms. Even typically neutral influencers reposted the clip, some with captions like, "Not a fan of her politics, but that was art." Inside the venue, the energy had shifted irreversibly. Those who had dismissed Karoline as nothing more than a polished mouthpiece now looked at her with recalibrated eyes. Conversations changed from policy to performance, from division to the unexpected depth behind her poised exterior. A few of Julian's own fans stood in silent conflict, admiration battling ideology. Meanwhile, Karoline moved through the crowd with quiet composure, receiving congratulations from donors, operatives, even skeptics. She offered modest nods, never letting the moment swell into gloating. She knew better. She hadn't played to prove them wrong. She had played because it was the only honest thing she could do. Backstage, Sabrina scrolled through the storm online, her jaw slack with disbelief. "You just hijacked the entire news cycle," she whispered to Karoline, holding out her phone like evidence in a trial. "They're calling you the soul of the movement." But Karoline didn't respond right away. Her eyes were on the piano still sitting at center stage, now quiet, but not forgotten. Across town, Julian Armand sat slumped at a bar, his name no longer trending, hers was. He scrolled bitterly through videos of the night, each one a mirror to his miscalculation. What the world saw was simple, a woman mocked for being hollow who turned out to be the one with the most depth in the room. Karoline hadn't just survived the ambush. She'd rewritten the narrative, and this time the world was watching her for the right reason. The noise of the gala faded behind her as Karoline stepped into the quiet of her modest apartment just outside D.C., exchanging marble floors and chandeliers for creaky wood and the soft whir of a baby monitor. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, replaced by something gentler. Relief, exhaustion, and an unfamiliar peace. Nicholas, her husband, looked up from the couch, his graying temples catching the lamp's glow. Their infant son slept nearby, oblivious to the firestorm his mother had just ignited online. "I saw it," Nicholas said simply, his smile small but knowing. He pulled her into an embrace that grounded her more than any standing ovation ever could. "Social media's going wild over you. You broke the internet." Karoline let out a quiet laugh as she kicked off her heels and sank into the piano bench by the corner window. An old upright he'd gifted her on their first anniversary, but one she rarely touched. Tonight, though, it called to her like an old friend. Nicholas watched as she laid her fingers softly on the keys. This time, she didn't play to silence anyone. She didn't need to prove herself. She let the notes flow gently, improvising a melody that felt like an exhale, raw, unguarded, real. The chords were quieter than the glass house's grand piano, but they mattered more. Here, in the quiet, she didn't feel like the press secretary, or the woman who had stunned a crowd with Gershwin. She felt like herself, whole again. When she finished, Nicholas leaned in, his voice low. "How do you feel?" Karoline paused, her eyes fixed on the keys. "Like I just remembered who I am," she whispered. In that moment, it wasn't about trending tags or political wins. It was about rediscovery. She hadn't played to win anyone's approval. She had played to reclaim a piece of herself. And she had. Not on the campaign trail, not in front of flashing cameras, but here, at home, with nothing but quiet and keys. Long after the ovations faded and the viral storm settled into statistics, shares, likes, headlines, Karoline sat by the window in her apartment, the city lights flickering far below like scattered stars. Her son slept in the other room. Nicholas had gone to bed, but she remained, fingertips resting idly on the keys of the old upright piano. Not playing, just thinking. The night's events hadn't just shifted the media narrative, they'd shaken something loose inside her. Something she hadn't realized had grown so buried. For years, she had fought to be taken seriously in a world that rarely offered second chances to young women in politics, especially conservative ones. Every press briefing was a battle, every headline a negotiation between what she said and what others wanted it to mean, so she'd armored up. She had built walls, intellectual, emotional, strategic. The world respected sharp lines, not soft curves. Passion made you vulnerable, music even more so. But tonight proved something different. The real battle hadn't been between her and Julian Armand. It hadn't even been between left and right, art and policy, arrogance and restraint. The battle had always been internal, between the person she was told to become and the person she had once been. A girl who had sat at an old church piano and believed that beauty was strength, not weakness. Somewhere along the way, that girl had been told to grow up, that seriousness left no space for sentiment, that politics required performance, not poetry, and so she'd buried her song beneath sound bites. Until tonight. Julian had expected her to crumble because he mistook polish for pretense. He thought a press secretary couldn't possibly carry soul, but that was his failure, not hers. And it wasn't just his. It was a wider failure, a cultural reflex to assume that people are only what their party says they are, that an artist can't believe in border security, that a mother can't be a fighter, that a conservative can't possess grace. Karoline had carried that weight for years, silently enduring the snide jokes, the dismissals. But at that piano, she realized something critical. You don't have to choose between strength and softness. You don't have to abandon one identity to claim the other. She hadn't reclaimed the stage to prove Julian wrong. She had stepped forward to prove herself right, to show that the thing she thought she'd lost wasn't gone. It was waiting, dormant, for the right moment. And that moment had come, not with a press release, not with a clever quote, but with a note. A single note that grew into a storm, then into silence, then into something else entirely. A reckoning. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more headlines, more critics, more staged confrontations. Some would praise her, others would mock her. That was the nature of the game. But now she played it on her own terms. She no longer feared being underestimated. In fact, she welcomed it. Let them assume she was just a spokesperson. Let them forget she had fire behind her facts. She would remind them again and again if necessary that the most dangerous kind of woman wasn't the one who shouted loudest, but the one who listened first, and then answered with something they couldn't predict. Karoline closed the piano cover gently and stood, her reflection faint in the window glass. She was still the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, still a lightning rod, still a warrior for a movement that wasn't always understood, but now she was something more. An artist, unapologetically, a woman who had rediscovered her own voice not through argument, but through artistry. And that, she realized, was the real victory, not the applause, not the viral hashtags, but the quiet knowledge that she didn't just survive the battle, she'd changed the rules of the war. The story of Karoline Leavitt teaches us that identity is never singular, and that strength often comes from the parts of ourselves we hide. In a world that demands constant proof, performance, and political alignment, it's easy to abandon the softer pieces of who we are in order to survive. Karoline buried her love for music to become the sharp-tongued strategist the political world expected, but when confronted and mocked, it wasn't her intellect or title that saved her. It was the courage to reconnect with her buried passion. By choosing to play, she defied expectation, shattered stereotype, and reminded everyone, including herself, that authenticity is the most powerful form of resistance. The lesson isn't just about defending yourself against arrogance or rising above humiliation. It's about the quiet, often forgotten power of returning to what makes you you. Whether it's art, faith, family, or forgotten joy, those passions carry strength, not weakness. Karoline won not because she fought back with facts, but because she allowed the world to see her full humanity, unapologetically, and in doing so, she didn't just change minds, she reclaimed her own. The real triumph wasn't in silencing her critic, it was in finally hearing herself again.